So welcome to today's podcast series, Ripping Up The Rulebook. We're here with Gareth Pierce today from Forget Me Not Children's Hospice. So Gareth, you lead an environment where culture isn't just a buzzword. It's certainly something that's felt deeply every single day, every moment. When you're supporting children and families through the most difficult times of their lives, I guess for you, leadership, trust and emotional resilience takes on a completely different meaning. So thank you for joining us today and talking to us about this topic. And I know it's something that you're deeply passionate about. In the heart of Ripping Up the Rulebook, which talks about breaking conventional and traditional ways of how leadership might show up, which do you think of the traditional leadership roles don't work in that high-stake, emotionally charged environment that you guys work in every single day?
There's a few things to talk about. I think you use the word emotion to start with, and I think in our organisation and in any sort of sector where the work that you're doing is looking after people is incredibly emotional in itself. Emotion comes into everything you do. And quite often when you're going through, I don't know, a leadership development program or something like that, you'll hear about, remove the emotion, make the decisions that seem logical, use the gut feel, but, try and remove the emotion. That's not possible.
No.
It's just not possible. I've been at Forget Me Not for nearly 10 years. And I don't think there's ever a time when emotion doesn't come into what you do on a day-to-day basis, whether that be making decisions, deciding on a particular direction, writing a strategy. I think emotion is always there. And although sometimes you do have to try and pull it to one side or remove it, it's almost impossible to do that just because of what you're doing, because that emotion is linked to the purpose of what you're doing. And ultimately, we're always going to try and make the right decision to drive the purpose. Mm-hmm. So then removing the emotion gets incredibly hard.
Yeah. And you're quite unique in that environment, perhaps maybe somewhat different to maybe some of the listeners might be familiar with in their workplace. So how do you strike that balance between having the emotion there, because it is fundamentally important because of your purpose? You are supporting children and their families at the most difficult times of their lives. But how do you balance that while still striving for excellence?
I think you've got to use that emotion, and it goes back to the purpose that we talked about. I think purpose in anything you're doing is critical. You've got to understand why you're doing it and what you're doing it for. And I think in our world, in the world that we operate in on a day-to-day basis, it's probably easier to find that purpose and to channel that purpose because it's there. It's in front of you every day. We talk about it every day. We see it every day. We experience it every day. So linking everything back to that purpose is the way that I think it makes things easier to understand and do. And going back to that point about emotion, as long as that emotion is firmly anchored and linked in the purpose, then there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
As long as you do it in the right way.
Yeah. So we've done some work together recently around this theme with your leadership team, and you are quite inspiring that you, from an outside perspective looking in, although I do and I have worked with you and your team to facilitate some of these discussions, do you want to just talk us through why you decide to make that investment in your leadership team around purpose, that emotional connection? But what was your thinking behind those decisions, Gareth, in terms of why you prioritised working with your leadership team to reinforce some of the behaviours and values in this, what is an emotionally charged environment? What was your thought process up to that point in deciding, yes, this is important for us and this is a journey that we want to go on?
So I think there's probably two answers to that, and there's an internal answer and external answer. So I think the external one first. The hospice sector at the moment is navigating its hardest journey for over 20 years. So as a sector, from a financial perspective and a sustainability perspective, it's difficult. Every hospice up and down the country are experiencing the same challenges, the same issues, and really sort of struggling to remain sustainable, albeit in different ways, depending on their individual positions. So times are hard, really hard. And we experienced at Forget Me Not about 18 months ago now, we had to make some really difficult decisions. We had to reduce our overheads, reduce our costs, change the way that we're doing things as an organisation. So I guess that's sort of the external bit in terms of the pressures that we're facing as a sector, and obviously that's impacting us as an organisation and has done. So we've just written a new strategy, just entered in a new sort of strategic period as an organisation. And when we were creating the pillars of that strategy, one of the pillars that we firmly sort of put right at the very beginning was about foundations. And one of the key things about that foundational pillar was people. Because going back to the emotional bit before, we recognise as an organisation we can't do what we do without people. No. Now, that might seem obvious and might be the same for every organisation, but for us it really is about people. Whether we're fundraising, it's about people. Whether we're opening new charity shops on the high street, it's about people. Or, of course, looking after and supporting children and families at the most vulnerable time in their lives, it really is about people. So getting that people and foundation pillar cemented and right is really important. And at the top of that list is culture. And that's not because we think we have a bad culture. We do lots to measure our culture and to monitor it. And actually, there's loads of great things about our culture and loads of things that make us really special as an organisation. But having launched a new strategy in the most difficult time that the sector's seen in 20 years, with the climate as it is, we have to make sure our culture is absolutely set up to make sure that strategy succeeds, which is why it's at the top of the list. Yeah. So it's about evolving, improving and making adjustments to that culture so that we can succeed as an organisation. And I guess the bit that I stepped up to CEO about 2 years ago, and I think one of the things I identified was, hospices are incredibly complicated organisations with lots of different industries within them. So to find a way for your culture to sit across the whole organisation can be quite challenging. Yeah. Because you've got different types of people, different parts of the organisation with different priorities and different focuses. So one of the things we talked about with our leadership team is how do we find that thread that runs through everything, no matter who you are, where you work, which bit of the job you're doing, because everybody plays a part in supporting children and families, but does it slightly differently. Yeah. So no matter which bit of that job you're doing and no matter which part of that journey you're on, what is the purple thread that runs through everything that you do? From before people join the organisation through to after people have left. And that's really important for us and for me as a leader. So the reason it's on the list and the reason we started looking at it and the reason why we've asked you to support us with that is because we want to make sure that we find what those threads are. Yeah. We absolutely cement them into the organisation and we do it in a way that helps us to then ultimately survive and be here in the future for families and children that need us in years to come.
We talked about the complacency piece, didn't we, when we was in early discussions around the how do we make this happen, in that having culture at the top of one of those foundational pillars means that it's something not to become complacent in, that there is a continuous need for investment in understanding the culture, evaluating it and reinforcing those key messages, whether that's your purpose, your values, your behaviours. And I see that at Forget Me Not, that this isn't just a tick box exercise, but this is a conversation that is going to be continuous so that the message is consistent across a team that is quite dispersed. So you do have, like you said, you've got people out in trading in the shops, You've got the care team at the hospice out in the community, in the hospitals. And that's no mean feat in terms of how do you bring together all these different people who have maybe different perceptions of what forget-me-not is and the messages, so that actually the team are aligned.
Mm-hmm.
On that then, when you decided to do some work with us in terms of bringing the leadership team together more recently, I think it's important to acknowledge that, and you've said this earlier, culture's always been a main focus, particularly for you whilst you've been in this role. But it was about bringing together all the different messages into a way that people could understand what it was you were trying to say, or the messages that you were trying to get across, not just to your leadership team, but to everybody who's connected to Forget-Me-Not, whether that's employees or volunteers. You want to create that same experience. So in terms of that leadership forum that we facilitated just a couple of weeks ago, what was your hope from that? What were you hoping to gain in the long term?
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
Sorry. No, it's good. So, I mean, one of the things, going back to why we started and why we put this at the heart of our strategy, was as an organisation, we and this is just typical of a hospice in the hospice sector. We're agile, we move quickly, we react to things really well, but that's as a result of a young organisation. You know, we're only sort of 15, 16 years old as a hospice. Having gone through some pretty challenging times over the last few years, you become really agile and you become really good at reacting to those things. But then that also applies to your strategy as well and your culture. So over the years, we've reacted to things within our culture. And every time you react, I don't know, you might do a colleague survey and it tells you something. So you create something, or you come up with a new initiative, or you design something to try and address that thing that's come up. But then I think what we've maybe not done as well over the years on occasion is those things haven't stuck. And they haven't, you know, culture needs to sit at the very heart of the organisation. It needs to be embedded. People talk about it all the time, embedding culture. Well, you know, there's a lot of things that we've done that do sit really well and are really embedded, like our values, for example, at the heart of the organisation and are really well embedded. But then I could reel off a whole host of other initiatives and things that we've rolled out, they've maybe been talked about a little bit, and then they've disappeared and they've sat in the background. And one thing we did at the start of this journey, probably 12, 18 months ago when I sort of stepped up into this role, was I said I wanted to look at culture, I wanted to think about our culture. And I said, let's get out all of our, what we would class as our cultural documents, you know, documents, initiatives, things that sort of sit in and around and underpin our culture. And there was a lot, you know, when you got all those things out and put them all on the table and sort of looked at them all. And some of those things, even our leaders had forgotten about, you know, let alone our colleagues or even our volunteers, because we have a lot of volunteers as well. So what did we set out to do? Well, we set out to sort of rationalise that so that when people talked about culture, they could identify what we meant by culture. Because I think that's really important. When you talk about culture, it's a bit of a buzzword, isn't it? Culture. But actually, when you ask somebody, but what is culture? Or what is our culture?
What is it like to work here?
It's like people generally can't answer that question. So that was our starting point. We got all this stuff. You know, we were quite strict. What's in, what's out, what's embedded, what's not. What do we want to keep? What don't we want to keep? But then how do we get to a point where when you ask somebody that question, they can tell us what the answer is?
Yeah.
And they can give us that answer. And where I wanted to get to was a point where when somebody joins on day one, joins the organisation, we're very good at inducting people into the role, but how do we induct people into the culture?
Yeah.
And how do we take them through that journey? And then finally, the thing I wanted to achieve was when I'm not here and I win the lottery and I'm lying on a desert island somewhere enjoying the cocktails, the culture needs to live on.
Yeah.
you know, and I think there are certain parts of our culture as an organisation that are really deep rooted and will live through any change, any leadership transition, will remain there forever. But there are other things that I knew would come and go with change.
Yeah.
And where I want to get to is leaders will always bring their style and their view and an angle on culture, but fundamentally culture should remain the same.
Yeah.
And should be so deep rooted that change doesn't influence it. And that's what I wanted to achieve through this piece of work. So for me, the starting point was bringing our leaders together to start that journey as a group. Mm-hmm. You know, so if we can all agree what are those things, what are those threads that run through the organisation, then we can start to talk to others about that. And it's our leadership team, I think, that are the ambassadors for our culture and the influencers for our culture, because they sit in that unique position where day to day they're working with their teams, working with people across the organisation. So they're the ones that can really sort of drive that compass and where that culture sits.
And I guess it's important to just say that when we had that day with your leadership team, it was a lot around information sharing. So bringing together, as you said, lots of great work that's been put into place over the years into one source of truth, if you like, which is the anchor to what our culture is and how we form decisions, our purpose, and creating consistency. But what was really interesting, it was an opportunity for us to listen in as well, to understand, well, where are the blockers in really being able to bring this to life in a way that wherever you are at Forget Me Not, you feel you have the same experience. The culture is consistent. And what that did was bring to life some of the areas where there's an opportunity for more focus and more interventions just in the usual day-to-day ways of working that were maybe inhibiting bringing to life the culture that you aspire to have. So it was a good tool, I think, in terms of being able to feed back up to the senior team to say, this is an amazing initiative that you're running with your leadership team, but also a great opportunity from you to learn from your people around maybe what's absolutely working well, but where your attention may need to be more focused on. Would you agree that was valuable?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've done it with the leadership team, but we've also done it in other forums as well. And I think that is got to be the start of the journey, because it goes back to that piece around what is culture. Well, to work out what culture is and what our culture is, we have to talk to our colleagues at every level, across different parts of the organisation, to understand what they believe that culture to be. So yeah, absolutely. And that is, I think, something that we did get out of the day. And it's those little gems of information that you can't, you can then use those in whatever you do in the future.
For sure, and also creating a sense of safety as well, that it's okay to have these really honest conversations about what's not working as well. Maybe you weren't aware, or maybe the subject was a little bit taboo. Maybe it was in certain places, such as this is the way things have always been done, or maybe we've seen this initiative happen before and it maybe stopped. But creating that environment where it was absolutely safe and secure for everybody to show up as their full self and be honest and give that honest feedback.
I think just talking about culture,
yeah,
because we've measured culture a lot through surveys and through similar things, but talking about culture is different. Talking to each other about culture makes a huge difference. Yeah. What
piece of advice then would, Gareth, you give to other corporate leaders that can maybe learn from your approach then into creating this trust and this common purpose? What would you say?
Well, I think the first thing is find a common purpose. And as I said, earlier, it's probably easy for us to do that because of what we do. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what you're doing. Every organisation, every business has a purpose.
For sure.
And I think what's really important is get to the heart of that purpose If you're an organisation that builds something, makes something, or sells something, that's not your purpose.
No.
Your purpose is why. There's a reason why you do that. Most organisations have a story behind that why. So dig and keep digging until you get to the heart of the purpose, and then speak to your team about that purpose. And it's not an easy thing to do. You've got to keep digging, keep getting to the root, keep pushing until you find that sort of hidden gem that is the absolute heart, the beating heart of your organisation, and the thread. And that, if you can identify that thread, then you're halfway there. Because then people will affiliate with that, they'll hook onto that, and you'll start to go on that journey together. So I think finding that thread and finding your purpose is really important. And I think just open up the conversation and talk about it, and measure it. We do. We've always done some sort of survey to measure our culture, but more recently we've increased the intensity of that. So we now do a pulse survey more often, and that's really important, especially when you're in an organisation that changes quickly, is agile, faces a lot of challenges. You need to understand where your culture is, what it's doing, what the trajectory is, to be able to do something about it.
And I've got to say, you guys are doing it amazingly well. Although still a young organisation, and it'd be easy to become distracted with the huge priorities that you have, because let's not underestimate what you do for children and families in the area. It could be quite easy for leaders to deprioritise this subject, but you guys absolutely don't, and it's there, it's consistent, and you're involving everybody in the discussion. So kudos to you guys, because it's amazing what you're doing. But just before we wrap up then, Gareth, in light of the subject of the series, which is ripping up the rule book, so being bold enough to challenge that status quo around leadership, if you could rip up one rule about workplace cultures that leaders often cling to, it's a tough one, what would it be, and what should it be replaced with?
It's a good question.
Thanks.
I think that there's probably two for me, if I can have two.
Of course you can.
I think the first one that I was reflecting on before I sort of came here was around, certainly in the hospice sector, we're seeing a real shift in terms of the leadership that you see at the CEO position and directors in hospices. And the shift is that in the climate that you're operating in, quite often having the leadership in those roles who know how to navigate that climate and can help to sort of overcome the challenges that you're facing may be different to the norm. So traditionally in hospices you would see a lot of people in leadership positions who have been in sort of nursing roles and care-based roles, and that's shifted a lot. So the shift that we've seen across the sector is more people like myself from sort of income generation, commercial roles, moving into those leadership positions, because right now, in terms of sustainability for the sector, that's what's needed, and that's how organisations like us are going to sort of thrive in the future. That's not to say that it's really important to still have those other people in those leadership teams. And there are lots of leaders who are from those backgrounds, but around them will be really strong people who have also got those commercial backgrounds who can drive that side of what the organisation needs. But I think the other thing is around, going back to what I said earlier, you can't force culture. So we've talked a lot about it being high on the agenda, and we talked about having a real focus on it, but that's got to be done in a way that allows culture to move forward and allows it to develop and evolve.
Yeah.
And I think too often, culture has a badge almost, and there's a big difference between giving culture a badge and labelling it to doing the things that we've talked about today, working out what the purpose is, what's the thread that runs through it, understanding it and making sure that people can attach themselves to it, If you don't do it in the right way, then you can almost just label it, put it to the top of the pile, do some work on it, but then as soon as you leave it alone, it'll go back down the pile again.
It's counterproductive.
And it's counterproductive. Yeah. And it's that, I guess, tokenism maybe is the word I would use in that, sometimes you hear about culture being spoken about and, we must do this because for our culture, we must improve our culture on this. Sometimes it's just using the word as opposed to really sort of getting under the skin of it, under the bonnet of it.
It has to be really meaningful and aligned to your common purpose.
Absolutely.
And not seen as something that sits separately to everything else.
That link, it's the same thing. Your culture and your purpose are hand in hand. And if you don't get those two bits right, then don't start down the journey until you've got those bits right. Yeah. Absolutely key.
In light of the series title, Ripping Up The Rulebook and challenging the status quo, quick fire round for you now. Which one rule have you ripped up, or would you advise ripping up?
So I think there's a rule, a lot of when you talk about leadership, a lot of people say, it's the leader that must have all the answers, or, you always look to the leader for that direction and those answers. I'm not sure that's true. So nearly 10 years ago when I joined Forget Me Not, I was coming from a totally different sector into a new sector. And I was challenged on that in my interview. And the question was, how will you adapt to the new sector and how will you learn the new sector? And I said, well, if I don't know, I'll go find out. Mm-hmm. And 10 years later, that's still what I'm doing. If I don't know, I go find out. Okay. And we have a series of leadership traits at Forget Me Not that we're in the process of embedding with our leaders. One of those leadership traits is curiosity. And I think curiosity is absolutely key for leaders. They can't know everything. They don't know everything, especially in a complex organisation. And that's why you put people in your team who do know and are experts in each area. But if you don't know, you go find out.
What's the advantages of that?
You don't have to be an expert in everything. You can lead in a way that sort of looks over the whole organisation and doesn't focus in on one area. But also, I think the more knowledgeable you become around each area, it helps you to become a better leader.
And that's come from lived experience. So you shared your story there. Yeah. And we've talked a lot about emotion in workplace and how it plays such a vital role in your workplace culture. How can you advise others, maybe in a different organisation entirely to what you guys do? How do they dial up emotion?
So I think emotion is linked to purpose, as we talked about. So find what that purpose is and make sure that those emotional conversations are channeled through that purpose. And if you do that well, you can then use that to drive so many things that you're doing as an organisation, driving a strategy, changing part of your service delivery, developing products. If you get that purpose right, all those things become easier. But what I should say is that I think that emotional part has got to be backed up, especially in our environment, by supporting your colleagues. We do a lot of work on resilience, well-being, looking after our colleagues, and more recently starting to talk about compassionate leadership and compassionate culture. And that's really important, particularly in the work that we do. So it's that balance between finding that emotion, linking it to your purpose, but also really supporting your colleagues with those things that you know.
So channeling that emotion and that energy in a way that links back to purpose and meaning. Okay, last question then. What rules are not working? Traditional, stereotypical rules around leadership. What needs to stop?
I think you've got to be agile at the moment. The world is a very complicated place, and especially in recent years, things are coming at you from every angle. Whilst it's important to have consistency, to have a clear strategy, to have a clear set of objectives, there's got to be agility baked into all of that. And it's really difficult to balance the two. Having a strategy and a plan for the future that can change and adapt and evolve and be agile is a really tricky tightrope to walk. But I think it's got to be done.
So stepping out of your comfort zone.
Look for the opportunities that might not be obvious. Look around things. Don't just look at the things that are in front of you, and consider what might change in the future. And I think that agility and that needing to sort of pivot and adapt as an organisation is only going to increase, and is something that you need to do.
Yeah. I think being bold enough to try something new, maybe be creative, might feel uncomfortable for a lot of people, but it's okay to try.
Absolutely.
And learn from the mistakes and keep refining until you find that sweet spot.
And it goes back to my point about curiosity. One thing that I think is incredibly good about leadership in the hospice sector is that we work together a lot, speak to other organisations, speak to other leaders, find out what other people are doing, share your problems, find out how other people are tackling those problems, because the answer will be out there somewhere. It goes back to curiosity.
Gareth, thanks for answering those short fire round questions. I could sit and talk to you all day. Maybe get you back again to talk more about compassionate leadership.
Perfect. Thanks for having me.
Have a good day.
Thank you.